All right, it's just coming upon 3 o'clock, so it looks like we're ready to roll. Hello everyone, bonjour tout le monde, and welcome to Sustainability in the Digital Age SDA, the first sustainability think tank at Concordia University that explores how digital innovation can support the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I'll pass it over to our panelists in a moment, but first, just to help situate you, we are streaming on YouTube Live from Concordia University's fourth space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Jagé, Montreal. And as caretakers for the lands and waters we are meeting on today, we'd like to extend our gratitude to the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation for their teachings about the earth and our relations. At Fourth Space, if you're new to us, either in person or online, welcome. We work with our university community to mobilize knowledge by co-creating daily activities, such as today's conversations that invite Concordians together with external partners and audience members to examine some key ideas and initiatives that are in development here at the university. So this is very apropos here today. So welcome all. Just a quick note about engagement. If you're in the space and want to jump into the conversation, if there's room and time for that, just raise a hand and we'll get a microphone to you. And if you're joining us via Zoom and have a comment or a question, you're more than welcome to unmute yourself and jump in at that point. It is now my pleasure to pass the floor to Deputy Director of SDA, Jennifer Gerard. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Anna. As mentioned, I am Jennifer Gerard, Deputy Director of Sustainability in the Digital Age. And I've been engaged with this initiative and with our work since its very earliest stages, when I was in part of the team developing the Digital Disruptions for Sustainability, Research, Innovation, and Action agenda. The agenda and the many collaborations that led to its development really set the foundation for the exciting work that we're going to be hearing about today. And I'm very grateful to all the people that we've had the chance to meet and learn from as we've grown along our path. So I'm honored to welcome you all, both physically and virtually, to this conversation about sustainability in the digital age, Concordia University's first sustainability think tank. Today we're going to be hearing from a wonderful panel of speakers and have the chance to hopefully interact with some audience questions, both live and online. But before we get started, let me introduce our panelists. Eliane Ubali-Joro is a research associate professor in the Department of Geography here at Concordia. She's also the Global Hub Director for Future Earth's Canada office and the Executive Director of Sustainability in the Digital Age. Eliane's decades of experience span academia, science policy, and the nonprofit and international development sectors. She's a member of Rwanda's National Science and Technology Council and has also been a member of the Presidential Advisory Council for Rwandan President Paul Kagame since its inception in September 2007. Eliane was recently invited to join the External Advisory Committee to the Chief Statistician of Canada on the country's first census of the environment. Eliane is a member of the Impact Advisory Board of the Global Alliance for a Sustainable Planet, of the Capitals Coalition Supervisory Board, of the Global Crop Diversity Trust Executive Board, of the China Council for the International Cooperation on Environment and Development, and many more. Eliane's career path was featured in Forbes in celebration of International Women's Day 2019. And she's one of the recipients of the International Leadership Association's 2022 Awards in Women in Leadership for Outstanding Practice with Broad Impact. Over here on Eliane's left, we have Jason Lewis, who is a professor of Design and Computation Arts and University Research Chair in Computational Media and Indigenous Future Imaginary. He's a digital media artist, poet, and software designer. He founded OBX Laboratory for Experimental Media, where he directs research and creation projects using virtual environments to assist Aboriginal communities in preserving, interpreting, and communicating cultural histories, in devising new means of creating and reading digital texts, and in developing systems for the creative use of mobile technology. He's the director of the Initiative for Indigenous Futures, a 7-year SSHRC-funded partnership focused on how Indigenous communities imagine themselves 7 generations hence. Professor Lewis co-founded and co-directs the Aboriginal Territories in Cyberspace Research Network that is investigating how Aboriginal people can participate in the shaping of our digital media future. And he co-directs workshops combining traditional stories and game design in the Kahnawake First Nations High School. He is deeply committed to developing intriguing new forms of expression by working on conceptual, creative, and technical levels simultaneously. Professor Lewis's creative work has been featured at the Ars Electronica Center by the International Society of Experimental Artists, by the International Association for Computing Machinery's Special Interest Group on Computer Graphics and Interactive Techniques, at the Urban Screens and Mobile Fest, and many other venues. His writing about new media has been presented at conferences, festivals, and exhibitions on 4 continents, and his work with Aboriginal territories in cyberspace has won multiple awards. Thirdly, Damon Matthews is a professor, research chair in climate science and sustainability, also here at Concordia University. Damon is a member of the College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists of the Royal Society of Canada and has published more than 100 research papers on topics ranging from quantifying the remaining carbon budget to assessing equitable approaches to allocate emission allowances to individual countries. He's internationally recognized for his work in policy-relevant climate science, as well as for initiatives such as the Climate Clock that use digital visualization and web-based technologies to motivate and accelerate climate action. Damon is the scientific co-director of Sustainability in the Digital Age, and he also directs the NSERC CREATE program, Leadership in Environmental and Digital Innovation for Sustainability, or LEADS, which trains graduate student researchers at the intersection of sustainability science and digital innovation. And finally, I'll introduce our moderator here today. Dr. Dominique Bérubé joined Concordia as Vice President of Research and Graduate Studies this past September and was appointed professor in the Gina Cody Engineering faculty in the Department of Chemical and Materials Engineering. Dr. Bérubé brings more than 20 years of experience in research, innovation funding, and administration. Since 2015, she's held the role of Vice President of Research at SSHRC, leading the vision for their core research funding programs and tri-agency programs. In this role, she's transformed the Canadian research ecosystem through different initiatives, bringing equity, diversity, and inclusion to the core of the evaluation of research, removing systemic barriers to access funding, and developing new programs to address the pandemic impact and to support interdisciplinarity, high-risk and high-impact research, and the Canadian biomanufacturing strategy. In this role, she's also led SSHRC's Indigenous strategy. Now I'll hand over to our moderator, Dominique. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think it works. Yes, it does. Thank you so much for the extremely nice introductions for everyone. And of course, I'm really honored to have this role as moderator of that prestigious panel this afternoon. It's really nice to have this as an activity on an afternoon like that. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I hope we'll have a great conversation. Please do not think in advance during the conversation about your questions. We only have about 6 questions to initiate the discussion, and we really want to have that conversation with, of course, the community that is here and also online. So I guess I have to start with you, Eliane, and you know why? Because obviously you're the spokesperson for the SDA, the Sustainability in the Digital Age think tank. So we really want to hear from you, to start with about the SDA itself and what are the issues and the challenges that you want to address through this initiative.
So thank you very much.
Mike.
Thank you very much, Dominique. It's a real pleasure. I just would like to just start really with the context of why Concordia. Concordia has supported Future Earth since its inception in 2015. And so sustainability in the digital age really has been an effort through a number of convenings that Future Earth and Concordia have been involved in that led to the Montreal Statement and the D2S report looking at digital disruptions and how they can help accelerate the work needed to get digitalization to support the acceleration of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So our aim at sustainability in the digital age is really being a think and do tank in terms of how can we help research to action, research to impact, research in terms of accelerating the types of policymaking that are going to enable the needed changes we need for more inclusion, diversity, and equity in how we really work towards a just transition in terms of climate action. We also see the importance of the leadership of the City of Montreal, of the Province of Quebec, of Canada, and really we're also rooted in the community strengths of Concordia University in terms of building the work we want to moving forward, working with Indigenous communities, Indigenous experts, elders. It's really about how do we use all the intelligence that we have access collectively in terms of human intelligence as well as planetary intelligence, bringing in artificial intelligence to really help us devise a way forward that really brings the best of our intelligence, our wisdom, and our hearts. Because really at the end of the day are we doing things that people care enough that they're going to be disrupted and do the needed changes to accelerate what we need to do. We know that we're not there yet. We're coming out of COP27, moving towards COP15. There's a lot to do. And really what we want is sustainability in digital age to work through the strengths that Concordia University has already put in place in terms of sustainability, in terms of student engagements. Concordia University has very active students that have pushed forward the need for having sustainability in every single student that graduates from Concordia. And so I think this is a really critical initiative. We know that there's huge efforts across provinces and territory in Canada to embed sustainability in the education system from the youngest age possible. And I think the model here at Concordia is a great one that we want to see move forward at all levels. And so we're here to work with researchers, with policymakers, with communities to really help accelerate all the efforts we need to do to get where we want. Because as Damon would say, the clock is ticking.
Yeah, I really like that approach in the sense that the knowledge is there, but again, it's how can we access it, how can we make it more accessible, how can we mobilize it. Et je pense que c'est quand même un bon moment aussi, Eliane, pour remercier les partenaires qui soutiennent évidemment le think tank. Je sais pas si tu veux dire un mot.
Oui, absolument. Merci beaucoup, Dominique. Oui, le Fonds de recherche du Québec a été un soutien incroyable depuis la création de Future Earth et continue à soutenir durabilité à l'âge numérique à l'intérieur de l'Université Concordia. Donc, nous sommes vraiment fiers du soutien que nous avons reçu du Fonds de recherche du Québec. Et nous voulons remercier le scientifique en chef du Québec, Rémi Quirion, pour son soutien, pour sa présence sur les conseils d'administration de Future Earth du pôle canadien et aussi sur celui de la durabilité à l'âge numérique. Et c'est vraiment important de réaliser que non seulement qu'il est chef scientifique du Québec, mais il est aussi le président de INCSA, qui est l'association internationale des aviseurs scientifiques au gouvernement. Donc, c'est l'importance de la science. Comment est-ce que la science informe nos politiciens et puis tous les agents administratifs qui travaillent en politique pour s'assurer que les décisions sont prises avec le plus de rigueur au niveau de la science. Et donc, nous remercions le FRQ et nous voulons aussi remercier Montréal International qui aujourd'hui, avec le CORIM, nous a aussi honoré à un événement avec Mila. Et nous remercions aussi Mila qui est un de nos partenaires clés au niveau du travail que nous faisons au niveau de durabilité à l'âge numérique. Et ici, j'ai deux de mes partenaires préférés à Concordia, Jason et Damon. Donc, c'est vraiment un plaisir pour moi de les avoir ici. Et c'est un plaisir de travailler avec Dominique. Elle est juste là depuis septembre, mais c'est très agréable parce que tout avance vite avec Dominique.
I think it's a great transition to the first question to Damon, because we mentioned the challenges related, the importance to accelerate the access to knowledge, and we know that from the researcher perspective, it's extremely important to make the knowledge that you produce accessible to policymakers. And as a climate scientist yourself, this definitely is one of your goals. And how do you see then your involvement in the think tank as a tool to support that effort?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. So it's interesting. I went to Ottawa for the day when we launched SDA at the Canadian Science Policy Conference, and so I attended a couple of sessions there. And one thing that struck me was there was a discussion in one of the sessions about how do we get scientists to engage more in policy, particularly young scientists. And I think there's a perception that there's a real need for from the policy community to access scientific expertise and to encourage scientists to engage with policy. From my perspective as a scientist, I have been trying to do that my entire career, and I think many others have as well. But it's not always easy to actually form those links and forge those connections and meet the people who you need to meet in order to actually start to have that influence. So there's sort of a desire on both sides to make this connection, and somehow the connection has not yet been made sufficiently. And so this is where organizations like SDA are, I think, super important to, one of the real strengths of a think tank is to convene groups of people around common themes and to build networks and to set up connections that lead to relationships and trust that allow for those connections and conversations to occur. And so, from my perspective, it's been very exciting working with Eliane and the others over the last couple of years. because you start to see how, as a scientist, I can actually start to join the conversations that potentially lead to actual meaningful change in the policy in the broader outside of academic world. And it's also the case that the scientific or the societal challenges that we are facing right now do require. There's a lot of talk about evidence-based policy and how important that is, but fundamentally these are difficult issues that require lots of different types of people contributing their expertise and their input to the process. And so the more we can create organizations whose mandate really is to create those networks of people and mobilize them and allow them to do important things, the faster we will make progress. And I think that's where SDA can really contribute importantly to this process.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're obviously three extremely involved and engaged scientists. When we just listened to the presentation and introductions, you're the three of you extremely involved in the different organizations. And you, Jason, obviously, from the list we had of the different projects and groups that you're involved with, you're definitely, trying, really committed to that work of knowledge mobilization and also, of course, production. You do run the Indigenous Futures Research Center at Concordia, also, obviously. Can you tell us a bit more about that, and how do you think yourself that the SDA can contribute to your work to elevate Indigenous wisdom?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, thank you all for inviting me to be part of this conversation today, and thank you all for coming. So the Indigenous Futures Research Center was established in 2021, right in the middle of a pandemic, actually. And what it is a research space that is open to all across the university. It's a cross-faculty research center. We have members from fine arts, arts and science, and the business school at the moment, hoping that we can get some of the people from engineering and computer science to join us. And the organizing principle is faculty who are doing research that engages Indigenous communities in some way. So it's super multidisciplinary. We have people working on language, on new media, on artistic practice, on entrepreneurship. So a really wide range of disciplines in the traditional sense, but all focused on this question of what kind of sort of knowledge production and knowledge exploration and production can we undertake in relationship and in collaboration with Indigenous communities, whether they're local, provincial, national, or international. So we're, to be really honest, we're still finding our way. We actually just had our first in-person dinner in the year and a half that we've existed last week, a holiday dinner. And it was funny because I forgot, I know everybody, but I forgot there were people there who had never met each other. So it's, everybody's experiencing that sort of thing these days. But we're really hoping that starting in January, we can really start getting some traction. We're going to have an Indigenous, we're going to have our first research symposium at the end of January, where we're going to get together the people and sort of talk about the work we're doing and invite the public to come in and listen and engage with us on that. So where we intersect with the SDA is something that we're still developing, but some of the first kind of purchase points is that there is a lot of sort of knowledge about our environment held within Indigenous communities. And traditionally that knowledge has been ignored by the wider society, if not actively suppressed. In the last, I would say that sustainability is not my direct area, so I could be wrong on this, but in my sense is maybe in the last decade or so, there's been kind of a bit of a change in that attitude of like, oh, wait a second, we're trying to figure out how to sustain these ecosystems. Maybe we should go talk to the people who have been living in them for thousands or tens of thousands of years, because they might know something about those places. So it's been really heartening, I think, to see that acknowledgement in the beginnings of sort of collaboration around how to bring together the knowledges that are held by the people of that place with scientific knowledges, with other sorts of knowledges that can be helpful for us to think about how to sustain these different kinds of ecosystems and the larger planetary ecosystem as we go forward, using all the tools that are available to us, and thinking through how can those collaborations happen. the very tricky thing is that there's a long history of sort of kind of exploitative knowledge extraction from Indigenous communities, particularly by the academy. So there's not necessarily the kind of the warmest attitude towards academics coming into communities and saying, hey, we want to know what you know. Like that model just doesn't work anymore. Everybody's trying really actively to figure out what the new model is, what really works, what's really a benefit, where there's real proximal benefit to those communities, and how do you develop really truly co-creative relationships and collaborations with Indigenous communities. And it's hard. It's very, very challenging. I'm Hawaiian and Samoan. My partner in research creation crime over the last 15 years is Ganawage Mohawk. It still took us 2 years of conversations with her community to find somebody to partner with us in our first efforts back in 2005. And it really meant just showing up, participating, being part of the community, being in conversation, and slowly understanding what it is that was important to them. So I think for me, part of what's exciting is using our work, using my relationship with Eliane and the SDA to sort of figure out how to sort of create models for doing that sort of work around sustainability. And then particularly my expertise is in digital and computational processes, and really thinking through how do we go about integrating those sorts of knowledge production and sharing tools with Indigenous knowledge production and sharing. These are things that, again, up until I would argue a decade ago, maybe 2 decades ago, we're seen somewhat in opposition of each other. When we started Aboriginal Territories in Cyberspace in 2004, we still had people who were like, both from outside, but also some inside the communities too, who are like, well, making video games or doing digital media, that's not an Indigenous practice, right? That's not part of our traditions. And so it's some other thing, right? Or it's not part of your tradition because the outside culture has a real investment in keeping us in a box that's very firmly planted in the past. And so there was also an argument of like, well, you can't really be Indigenous and also sort of engage with these very modern technologies. So a big part of the work that we've done over the last 15 years is say that's bullshit, and that we're not going to accept that from the outside culture, but we're not going to accept that from ourselves either, right? We're going to teach our youth that this is all one practice of continuity. And so how do we go about bringing these tools into these questions of how do we sustain our communities and our environments?
Yeah, thank you so much. The only thing I could maybe push back a bit is that a decade ago might be a bit short, considering that 25 years ago I started my PhD in environmental sciences. Time goes by.
It does, yes.
It's been quite a while. Thank you so much. We've had a great introduction by the three of you about the importance of the work that such a think tank can do. It's a bit mysterious, what is a think tank and why are we sitting in Concordia supporting the creation of a think tank. So I guess the second part of that discussion is a bit to understand a bit more concretely, the kind of work that we think can be done through the creation of such a unit, and why is Concordia supporting the creation of such a think tank. We've got, as Jason and Damon are involved in different research centers and founding your own research centers. By the way, I would love to be finding my way the way you do. You seem to be finding your way pretty well since you created the center. But but now the think tank is a bit of a different beast, and I think it's important to showcase that difference in the kind of work that we're going to do. We're going to go back to you, Damon, as planned. Of course, you run the LEADS program for graduate students of all Montreal's university. Can you just tell us a bit about the LEADS and how it intersects and connects with the SDA activities?
Yeah, so the LEADS programs, this is a graduate training program funded by the NSERC CREATE program, and there's at least half a dozen or so students here who are part of the LEADS program. So the idea for the theme of this program really came out of a conversation between me and the previous executive director of Future Earth. And so from the very get-go, it was it was a partnership between Future Earth and the 4 Montreal universities to build a graduate program that would, basically build kind of dual competencies or bilingualism amongst students across disciplines, and in particular between disciplines in the sustainability sciences and in the digital tech machine learning communities. So part of it is just kind of understanding what is out there and what tools can be leveraged, but also creating connections between people in doing sustainability research who want to amplify the reach of their research, and people in the computer science and machine learning world who are looking for less frivolous applications of AI and machine learning. I mean, I think one of the people I spoke to in that community made some comment that 99 point something% of all of the work being done in machine learning is fundamentally kind of sort of frivolous applications. I mean, not all of it, and many things are not frivolous to lots of people, but there's a lot of work that's going on to like make entertaining things, or help us shop more efficiently on Facebook, or whatever it might be, things that are fundamentally not moving the world towards a more sustainable place. And yet in that community there are many people who are looking for that application, and how we can leverage these very powerful tools towards sustainability goals. And so that was the idea of the LEADS program, was to create this program. And we're now into our 3rd year. We have about 40 students who are part of the program, who are receiving funding from the program to support their individual research project, but also then participating in specific training activities, like summer school course that we put on, like leadership training, which is also about like how do you work across disciplines, and how do you develop the tools as a researcher to kind of, and what does it even mean to be a leader in the world of sustainability, and what kind of skill sets do we need in order to help shift the world towards where we think it needs to go. So that's what LEADS is. And yeah, so it was a partnership between Future Earth and Concordia and the other universities. And so SDA has kind of emerged as the perfect home for LEADS, as a kind of a formal institutional partnership between Concordia and Future Earth. And Eliane and the rest of the SDA team have been super important in like developing and building and rolling out the program that we've come up with over the last couple of years, and going forward as well.
Moving the knowledge into action, into the knowledge that we have and the observation that we do, because as climate scientists, I don't know, we do a lot of observation and description and analysis of the situation, but at some point, how do we transform that into action and act as leaders in that, which is
yeah, I mean, and this comes back to why like these kind of network building activities are important. I mean, you have to, as a climate scientist, you have to write like a really, really darn good paper to have it actually be taken up by the world, right, and influence the world in and of itself. I mean, it does happen, and I think, for example, the very first planetary boundaries paper was maybe an example of that, kind of scientific paper that actually gets taken up and like has a real resonance in the world. But that's like, that's 1 in a million in terms of the paper that might do that. And so yeah, I mean, I've written a lot of papers, and collectively maybe they have an influence, but it's actually hard. It's hard to really see that or even argue that it's happening. And so yeah, finding ways to like join other communities who are kind of working on different aspects of the problem and contribute to that is super important to sort of amplify the reach of science, or even redefine what is the role of science in shaping societal problems, or solutions to societal problems.
And by saying that 6 of yours, or half a dozen of your students were here, you just gave me an idea, and I might go back afterwards when we finish these questions to ask one of the students to talk about their project to see how it works, because I'm really curious now. So Jason, can you continue and just talk to us? Because of course, Eliane mentioned that you're building a very large research program, which is called Abundant Intelligence, including many collaborators across the world. So can you just talk to us a bit about that project?
Yeah, absolutely. So Abundant Intelligence is a project to look at how the sorts of computational techniques that we're developing in artificial intelligence can be integrated into indigenous knowledge systems. That's the very top line of what we're doing. But as the Dean said, this is a project that spans communities here in North America, across the Pacific, in New Zealand, and in Australia, probably. But and so one of the challenges of a project like this, particularly working with Indigenous communities, is how do you operate at sort of an international level like that, while also keeping the actual research that you're doing grounded very locally. And so the way that we've set up the project is that we have what we call pods. And the pods are locally, are sort of research labs or research groupings. We're still working on the language, that are based in particular communities. So in the proposal, we just did a series of grants over the last year, and we're waiting to see if we'll get funded sometime in the spring. But so I have this weird verb tense going on. That's the reason why I said that. They're sort of like, it kind of exists, but it kind of doesn't exist at the same time. So just bear with me. So the idea is that, so there's a pod in New Zealand based around Massey University and in the Wellington area. And so that's going to be working with Maori knowledge systems. There's a pod at the University of Lethbridge that is going to be working with Blackfoot knowledge systems, because that's the territory around the University of Lethbridge, but then also Mohawk and Haudenosaunee knowledge systems, because the lead researcher on that, Jackson Two Bears, is Mohawk from Six Nations. So he's operating in both of those frameworks. And then there's a third pod in Hawaii, which is where my community is, based around the University of Hawaii. And it's going to be using Kanaka Maoli, so Hawaiian knowledge systems. And the idea is, and that all three of them are physically based in sort of media labs that are either sort of Indigenous determined and Indigenous focused, or have a really big Indigenous sort of part of what they do in terms of the research that they conduct. And the idea is that they create a convenience, a little bit like this, for space, sort of creating a convening space where we can have, there's going to be academics. It's funded through academic research, academics, but then also community members. So creating a space that's welcoming for community members to come in, and will be a combination of, community practice sorts of things, but then also conversations with the academics who are in there, who are looking at artificial intelligence. And the academics are coming from a really wide range of disciplines. So from art and design, from history and linguistics, and of course from artificial intelligence itself. So there's a bunch of researchers from Mila that are involved in the project. And the hope is that we can do two things at the same time, which is so we've identified 5 areas of research that are of high interest to AI researchers, and also of high interest to Indigenous researchers and Indigenous community members. So it's, I don't know if I can remember it. I wasn't planning on giving the list, so I can remember from the grant. So it's language, narrative, multi-agent systems, sustainability, and then a 5th one that I can't remember right now. So for instance, given where we're at right now, the pod in Hawaii is focused around soil science. And so the idea is, how do we bring together the knowledge that is held by elders and language speakers and practitioners of hula and chanting and things like that? Because all of these cultural practices, they've been bracketed off in the Western system as cultural practices, but within the Indigenous context, they're knowledge practices. So they encode knowledge of all kinds of different things, including a lot of knowledge about place, going back thousands of years. And so how do we bring that knowledge into conversation with the sorts of knowledge that's produced by AI systems that are looking at, for instance, large scale and long-term weather patterns and trying to make sense of them, that are looking at what's happening to soil over both very small periods of time and over a very large period of times. These are time periods that humans are not particularly good at really comprehending, but computational systems, particularly AI, can help us see the patterns that exist at those levels. How can we bring these different kinds of knowledges into productive conversation with each other in order to help sustain the Hawaiian environment, in a way that it aligns with the vision of Hawaiian people, so Kanaka Maoli people. Yeah, that's the short version. I could keep going on about that. But of course, what we're hoping is over the course of the project, that the methodologies that we develop in these different pods, in some ways they're going to be very specific to those pods, but hopefully there will be methodologies that we can generalize and that we will be able to share with other communities who have an investment in working with these technologies in ways that are very much aligned with local priorities. Because this is the problem. One of the problems we have, right, is that the drive for technology, both research-wise and industry-wise, is to scale. So, creating a technology that can address millions or tens of millions of people is how you make money, how you get your name up in lights. But that is counterproductive to, certainly with Indigenous communities, that's not what they're interested in. They're interested in technology that responds to their local conditions and that operates in a way that aligns with their values. But we don't think it's just Indigenous people and communities that have those sorts of feelings about technology. We think there's lots of other communities that have similar critiques of technology. And so we're hoping we can develop methodologies that help those communities as well.
Well, I'm a bit curious about one element, in terms of a challenge that you might be facing in doing that, in terms of data availability to make the Indigenous communities be able to work with the AI specialists. I mean, we can probably discuss that for an hour, but do you have a short answer? Does that?
So the short answer is the current grants are for a 6-year period. The first 2 years are just conversation. Right? It's just us all getting to know each other, right? Because we're dealing with, really respected local knowledge holders in these communities. And then we have, people like, prize-winning AI research scientists who have never really encountered Indigenous communities before, right? And so that first 2 years is really just a series of meetings and conversations to try to understand each other, try to develop some common languages, and a big part of it is figuring out what to do with the data. How do we protect the data? It's a big concern amongst Indigenous communities. How do they share the data? How do we protect the data? The protection, the data horizons can be very complicated, meaning that it could be this is data only for this family or this community, this longhouse or this community, or just other Indigenous people, right? And so we're going to have to, using things like OCAP and some other the international frameworks that have been developed to talk about Indigenous data sovereignty, we're going to have to develop our own set of rules about how we go about sharing data and how that data can be used. And it's going to be hard. It's going to be one of the hardest things we do, I think.
Yeah, I love the fact that the SDA can become sort of I was going to say a hub, let's say, of a place where we can develop the best practices for community-based research and collaboration with Indigenous, because that's something that's also missing in terms of all this experience that the researchers are developing with the communities, and the skills that they're developing are sometimes lost because they're not shared with their colleagues about how the best practices and how to do that. And that's definitely something that Concordia is committed to be able to offer, that kind of common knowledge and approach to work with the kind of work that you do. And Eliane, you've heard from two of your colleagues, and obviously the collaborations with them directly enriches your own work. So we'd really be interested to hear about how it contributes to your own research, and also, I guess, what you envision as the role for the SDA within the broader Concordia University ecosystem.
So I just want to start by just saying something really personal. When Jason was talking, it reminded me of sitting in on an event on Afrofuturism and the claiming of our future. When you come from a marginalized community, there's kind of this unwritten rule that you're supposed to go extinct. And so claiming your future is revolutionary in itself, that you can take the wisdom of your ancestors over millennia and work in a technological world and bring both and choose to decide what you take on both sides to create a future that you design. And so that requires a certain righteousness to say, I deserve a seat at the table and I deserve to design the future that honors my ancestors and honors me as an ancestor to future generations. And so part of the work I see is really, and this is something in terms of Concordia's strengths around equity, inclusion, and diversity, is how do we ensure an inclusive digital future for all that all get to contribute to? And so in the work we've done so far as SDA, we have really prioritized working with Indigenous experts, with Indigenous elders, and to really look at how do you integrate perspectives that matter in terms of ancestral knowledge to the data space. And so if we look at fair and care principles in terms of the importance of how do we look at data and who benefits, who owns it, what are the conversations that need to be had in order to ensure that there's respect in how we work with data, there's trust in how we build relationships with people, and taking the time to build those relationships and not have them be in an exploitative way, but really be in a way that brings people forward together in synergy is a really critical one. And so how we look at digitalization today, given all of the issues we know around artificial intelligence and bias and how mostly affected people are from marginalized community, I think there's a critical importance of creating spaces that convene and bring diverse voices together in how we move forward. And I think embedded in sustainability is really this idea of how do we build a future that builds on the intelligence and wisdom of our ancestors and brings on all of the innovations that we are moving forward with. And so the continuity of humanity in terms of who we are, in terms of living a respectful relationship with Mother Earth are really critical. And just to go back to some of what Jason was saying around soil, because I'm passionate about soil. And the reality is that 30% of soils around the world are degraded. And I come from Rwanda, and in Africa, 65% of soils are degraded. We know that food security in Africa, like the population is going to double between now and 2050. If you take the combination of climate change that has decreased productivity in agriculture by 30% since 1970, so my whole lifetime almost, and we take the issues around soil degradation, that combination creates immense stress on how are you going to feed a growing population, and how do we do that within planetary boundaries? And so the work that I see sustainability in digital age is how do we look at nature-based solutions? How do we look at locally? How do we look at it globally? And something Jason said around the pods and the context. So one of the data points that I find really interesting is 90% of AI projects fail because they're not grounded in local context. So I think, beyond the abundant intelligence work, I think it's in any AI project, how are we localizing, how are we contextualizing the work, and how are we working with people impacted by the work? And so if the people who are impacted aren't part of the co-creation of the work, it's very problematic, because who are we serving? Who is benefiting? And who at the end of the day can claim participation and leadership and stewardship of the work? And so in a world today where we know that 80% or more of the biodiversity on the planet is stewarded by indigenous population that present 20% or less of the population on the planet, it's really critical. How are we looking at those dynamics around biodiversity, technology, bending the curve on biodiversity loss, as well as looking at carbon sequestration, of course, but mitigating and adapting to climate change, and also on a planet where we have 7,000 languages and we have cultural and biodiversity and linguistic loss. How can the technological age help us in the preservation of culture, of languages, and understanding those linkages with the knowledge systems that actually help us understand how biodiversity has been used and for millennia and preserved? And so those critical linkages are really important. And so it's really important to work locally and to work in ways where we build trust. I think there's something, Jason was saying around how there were exploitative relationships in academia, and the need to build trust and the need to respect knowledge systems and work within two-wide seeing are really critical. And so part of it for me is how do we create spaces for convenings to listen in to allow very diverse voices to be heard and amplified, and ensure that we're using this diversity to really innovate socially, technologically, scientifically, policy making wise, to really have a collective future that allows a just transition where we leave nobody behind. So that's where I see the work of sustainability in the digital age is really this idea of a research think tank, do tank, in terms of bringing impact that really brings the best of sustainability and digitalization to the work we need to do locally and globally. And so I say I do global work.
You just made me think a bit about, because from the work that I've been doing in the last few years was a lot about removing that idea of opposition between diversity and research excellence, and everybody's been discussing that in the academic community in general, and it's impossible to have excellence if you don't have diversity. It's sort of synonym. But I really like that idea that, or at least you made me thought, because obviously you had it before, that sustainability is also diversity. So it's all tied together, in fact. So we're going to move to the questions. I don't know while people raise their hands and think about their questions slowly, whether it's online or in the room. Do you want to react to Eliane's final comments while people raise their hand for the mic? There might be somebody. Somebody's moving, but I don't know if it's for a question.
Sure, it's a hand.
I'm going to ask a student to talk about their project. Aha, we do have some online. Thank you, Anna, for bringing this on. Okay. I think the question is for you, Jason. We're all trying to read it at the same time, or at least you address.
Jason Lewis just addressed
how to massify. I guess accelerate.
How to massify indigenous knowledge. I don't like that, but I mean, I like it as a phrase. I'm a poet, so as language, I like massify. That's awesome. How would SDA align with UN's goals to insert land-based learnings in all COPs and more? So that's actually not a great question for me, because I don't work within the UN framework, so I'm not that familiar with the language. So it might be better for Eliane, or.
So one of the things I think that's in the work, for example, we're doing in Canada around nature-based solutions, we're working with Indigenous communities to look at stewardships of forests and of carbon sinks. And so one of the issues we have today is a standing forest stays a forest as long as that land isn't converted to agriculture. So you can cut the trees, but it stays a forest. And so how we're accounting for carbon emissions and carbon sequestration needs to take into account the stewardship of our forested land. And it's a big issue in Canada because with forest fires just amplifying, the need to look at Indigenous wisdom around how we manage and prevent forest fires is really critical. And so I see the need to look at how do we work in terms of Indigenous knowledge systems, how do we work with digital technologies, how do we bring both together in terms of accelerating how we use nature-based solutions to contribute to Canada's 2030 goals of protecting 30% of the land and waters. And I think it's really critical to understand that how we're looking at land has very different perspectives. And so part of one of the things we do is we have convenings where we bring very different expertise together around nature, around digitalization, around Indigenous points of view, to collectively learn and hold the creative tensions that are needed to find ways of identifying solutions collectively. One of the things I really enjoyed with the Abundant Intelligence groups is there were every Wednesday meetings for 2 hours for months and months. And it was time to build community, to learn from each other, to ask us questions and really say, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and let's figure out how to move forward together with honesty, transparency. And so part of really land-based learnings for me, especially moving from COP27 to COP15, is how are we looking at biodiversity within land use and land change? Because it's really critical that we realize that how we manage land and how we manage the biodiversity on the land are as critical as how much carbon are we sequestrating, but also, are we managing the standing forests well enough that they remain carbon sinks? And so those are critical things, and we're seeing things around wetlands and peatlands where areas that were carbon sinks are actually emitting carbon. And so these are really alarming issues that are not necessarily accounted for right now in terms of Canada's carbon budget. And so we need to look at these more seriously, and we need to really realize the immense knowledge that we have within Indigenous wisdom and knowledge systems, and how this can help us reverse the losses that we're seeing.
I'll wait until if I see any ends around, but I want to ask you at the same time while I look around, because and go back to something quite concrete for me, because you're very busy. You're very busy people in general, but with the launch of the SDA, even more with your CREATE projects, your Abundant Intelligence initiative. Somebody wants to collaborate with the SDA or want to collaborate with you, Damon, or, and get into the SDA, because the scope of what you're trying to do within the SDA is enormous, and so more people is needed, but at the same time, time is limited. So how do you make it happen, and
Like to talk about one of the projects we're involved in, which is the Coalition for Digital Environmental Sustainability with the United Nations Technology Invoice Office, the United Nations Environmental Program, the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, as well the German Environment Agency and the Kenyan Ministry of Environment and International Science Council. So for example, there's an action plan towards a sustainable digital planet. And so we're working with people all over the world around how do we actually take that action plan that was presented at Stockholm Plus 50 and turn into 9 action initiatives around the world that really can help accelerate digitalization, sustainability in the world. And so part of it is realizing that the more networked we are, the more we work together, the more we really live our interconnectedness that then reflects our interconnectedness with nature. And so one of the great things about our openness to partnering and working with people locally and globally is that none of us are going to get there alone. And I think the fabric of society has been fragmented. And even though we're in a digital age, we still live in islands of knowledge that are not connected at the level we need to really meet the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. So we are open to collaborations, and I really think that we also need to emphasize collaborations between the humanities and the sciences, and how we work with artists to amplify and elevate the storytelling that allows more people to understand the urgency of climate action, and that we all have a role. And yes, it's not about just individuals. We have systemic change that we need to play and advance, but that all of us can really work towards that.
Thank you. I do have a question in the room. Do you have a mic? It's coming. So.
Okay, my name is Alex Maglis. I work with the Applied AI Institute here at Concordia. Jason, you touched upon this approach to community-based research that I've heard you talk about in the past, and that's always struck a note. That's the importance of committing to relationality before we purport to drop into communities that we're not from, and to situate our work in relation to issues that we haven't personally experienced ourselves. And I find that so important and critical, but also at definite odds with the ways in which we approach scholarship, with the ways in which we approach our educational commitments in relation to funding mandates that have strict timelines in relation to course offerings that need to be wrapped up by the end of the semester. We have students that are acutely aware of the ways in which stuff's going sideways in the world right now, and so they want to drop in and affect the world and make it a better place. But that's so close to that savior mentality that sidesteps that year to 2 years of relationship building that really needs to happen for the work to happen in a right way. And so how do we reconcile these two perspectives that are inherently at odds? what are the recommendations that you'd have for our young scholars that are kind of coming up and learning about methods?
That's a great question. It's important to bring this back here around the student space and how we open it.
So I can talk about how we try to address that, because that's sort of an ever-present concern of ours. And the way that we do it is that, so Aboriginal territories and cyberspace has been around since 2005. So we initially developed that relationship. Skawanati, my wife, and my collaborator, and I developed that relationship, say with Ganawage, but then with other communities. And so the relationship is it's maintained through us as individuals and working together with them, but it's also maintained with AbTech. So people know what AbTech is and they understand AbTech, and we now have, I think, a good reputation within the community, but that's also spread to other communities. And so then our job is, because we work with students, so we have students coming in, new students coming in all the time. And up until just a couple of years ago, the majority were non-Indigenous. So we think a lot about what does it mean to bring, non-Indigenous people in general, but non-Indigenous students into these contexts where we're working very closely with communities. And what do we need to do to give them a good foundation, both in terms of knowledge and history, but then also in terms of protocol, sort of how to behave, how to communicate, how to offer help, and those sorts of things. And it's a very long, slow process. So what we do is we say to students when we bring them in, we're like, look, we're going to try this first semester, and if this works out really well at being a research assistant, then as long as we have money, we're committed to working with you until you're done, right? That's the sort of relationships we want to have with you as a student, but it's also really critical for the work that we do with community, right? That they come in, they spend time with us, they see how we act, they do projects where they're in the background, right? And see how other students interact who have worked with the community before, and hopefully learn how to be in a good relationship so that they can still come in on their 3-year timeline or 2-year timeline or 5-year timeline where they want to make a difference, they want to have some kind of impact, but they're able to do that within a longer term context, which is AbTech's series of relationships with the Indigenous communities that we work with. But there's a whole, one of the, when I'm feeling burnt out and sort of adversarial about things, one of the things I talk about is, that, my colleagues who don't work with community, there's this whole aspect, a huge time consuming aspect of our research that they don't have to engage in, right? They can just do the work, right? Whereas part of our work is that community building. And it's only been recently that has been really recognized. And I will say that's one of Concordia's strengths. It's one of the reasons why this work took root here, is because pretty much since I've been here, so in the early 2000s, Concordia has recognized the value of creating community relations, just in the benign thing of like my workload, right? Which is, where things come down to sometimes is like, how do people choose their time? And so I think it's important, I think that SDA is a really important avenue for thinking through how to create those longer term intermediary relationships. And certainly Future Earth, that's a big reason why Eliane and I are in conversation and relationship with each other. And that's what abundant intelligence is like creating this thing that sits in between these different time frames and cultures and languages that can build the relationships and maintain them over longer periods of time. So that it's not it's not people parachuting in on the one side, and on the community side, they're like, okay, there's an entity here that we know and we trust and we think is doing work that's beneficial to us and our kids in an educational way, hopefully anyways. So that's the way we do it.
Time has flown by. You were not expecting this, Eliane. I wanted to ask Damon, what he sees himself on this space of his work in the students and what he does in Leeds. And I wanted to give Eliane some time to le mot de la fin, obviously. So go for it, Damon. You've got a minute, and Eliane's gonna impossible in a minute, I know.
coming back to the question of how to get involved with the SDA, because I think that's actually really important. One of the reasons we're doing this is to encourage people to reach out and get involved. I mean, if you're a student, I think there are opportunities to take on an internship or do kind of work with some of the projects that are going on already in SDA. If you're a faculty or a researcher at Concordia, I mean, the entry point's a bit different, but there's opportunities to collaborate around grant applications, around kind of shaping the scientific direction of SDA. I mean, I have the role of science co-director for Concordia, and I am looking for other people who would like to participate in kind of a scientific advisory committee. And I think, so reaching, if you're someone at Concordia who would like to learn more and become involved, there will be a way of formalizing that within the organization.
Yeah, thank you.
I also just want to say, going back to your question of, tenure track, there's deliverables you have to do to get where you need to go. And so the advantage we have of the think tank Sustainability in Digital Age is we have core funding from the Fonds de Recherche de Québec. And so I'm a research associate professor. So I don't have to worry about the tenure track, but I worry about other things, obviously. But I think one of the things is the relationship building, the time it takes to build relationships. Like, I first heard about Jason from colleagues in Hawaii, and then Jason is really busy because I don't think Jason has a normal day. Like, he works a lot. And so it took a long time to make space to build our relationship, and he had to trust that I was really in it because I really wanted to do great work, and I wasn't in it to be exploitative in terms of how we would interact. And what I realized is the first year of my work with Future Earth was really about building relationships across Canada with Indigenous experts, Indigenous elders, and just listening. And it's a luxury that most tenure track professors don't necessarily have. However, having built this, I think we can build networks where the trust that I have, can build on the trust. It's like, we were working together, and then Mila came in, that we were already working with Mila. And it's like, how do we create spaces where you can say, well, I trust this person. You can trust this person. Because it's very, very important to create spaces of trust so that we can work together in ways that all of us will benefit. Thank you.
Well, that's your last words. So really going to thank everyone for joining this afternoon. I found it a fascinating discussion, and we're going to continue to discuss it. Just contact them, obviously, as Damon said. There's plenty of space to contribute to the discussion, but also to the actions, I would say. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dominique, for coming in to moderate this conversation. Eliane, Jason, and Damon, a pleasure always. And we hope that you continue to trust the relationship you're building with Fourth Space. We will look forward to working with you as the SDA work develops here. Thanks for those of you on Zoom. I see a lot of claps here. We appreciate you making the time. There's about 40 people who joined us in that space today, so we appreciate you. I know it's a beautiful day outside. I hope that we appreciate the folks who made it in here as well. Anyway, if you wanted to revisit this conversation, it's already been streamed to Concordia University's Fourth Space, so it's there for you to share with your friends and colleagues. Thanks, everybody. Until next time. Bye.